There is a new consensus player mock drafts are sending to the Jets with the 10th overall pick, and it would be a controversial choice. We'll break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, April 8th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Today, we're going to have a mock draft roundup. Periodically, I like to go through mock drafts as we approach the NFL draft, and the NFL draft is just 2.5 weeks away. Jets will hope to add to their talent base, and recent mock drafts have pointed the Jets in one direction. But before we get to that, I just want to explain why sometimes I go through mock drafts. It's not that I think that these necessarily have great predictive value. I don't think that, just because a mock draft sends the Jets a certain player, the Jets are necessarily going to pick that player. I think that mock drafts can be useful for a couple of reasons. First of all, many of the writers who put them together are connected in the league. So they give you a sense of the neighborhood where players are being valued. A player may not be the 10th overall pick, but if a player is sent to a team at 9 or 11, you know that player is probably going to be around in the range where the Jets pick. And if not, then he'll be selected just before the Jets pick. It gives you a sense of which players should be around when the Jets pick and which players are valued in the range the Jets are taking a player. And the other reason I go through mock drafts is it kind of lets you see the scenarios that could play themselves out. The Jets are picking 10th, so there are lots of different combinations of players who could go in the top 9. This gives you a chance to kind of game the situations out and see which play, see who could go in front of where the Jets pick, and it depending on the combination, which players might interest the Jets. So with those caveats, those are the reasons I take a look at mock drafts. Now, recent mock drafts have actually come to a consensus with the New York Jets. In fact, there is a website, it's called mockdraftdatabase.com, and they essentially put together every mock draft they can find on the internet. And there's a player that has been sent to the Jets with the 10th overall pick in 55% of mock drafts. So over half the mock drafts have the Jets picking this player at 10. And it is University of Georgia tight end Brock Bowers. And this is a player I've discussed a couple times on the show. And if you're an everyday or if you've been listening to the show frequently, you know that I would not be a huge fan of the selection. And it's not necessarily that I think Bowers is a bad pick. It's all about the position. And I understand that some people will say, well, tight end is a position where you can get mismatches. Bowers is a guy who projects to be a mismatch every game he plays. And I get that. And if Bowers truly is an elite level tight end, if he's a top 3 tight end in the NFL, then I think that the pick could be well worth it. The issue is that there's no margin for error. And if you're an everydayer, you know that I'm a big believer that the draft is an inexact science, because I think there's a lot of evidence that points that way. And I've always believed that you want to build in some margin for error for your draft picks. And that can manifest itself in many different ways. One of the ways I think you build in margin for error is simply by adding extra picks, by trading down frequently, because it's very easy to miss on picks. In fact, even the best GMs miss on over half their picks. Even the best GMs have a lot of really bad swings and misses. The example I use most frequently is Bobby Beathard is a guy who's a general manager, who's an executive, who's in the Hall of Fame. So he's in Canton. Do you want to know who Bobby Beathard picked second overall in the 1998 NFL draft when he was the GM of the then San Diego Chargers? Ryan Leaf, one of the most infamous draft busts in history. You need to plan out how things will work out if you're wrong about a player. And if you're wrong about a wide receiver, if you think a wide receiver you draft in the top 10 is going to be a truly elite player, if you think he's going to be in like the Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson class, and he's not quite that good, and he's just like a 1,000-yard receiver, you've still done very, very well with your top 10 pick. With Bowers, I just don't think that there's enough margin for error. Essentially, with Bowers, if he's not great, if he's not a top of the league tight end, then you're not going to be satisfied by picking him 10th overall, because you can get a functional tight end later on. You don't need to use up huge resources to get a functional tight end. And by the way, last year, Tyler Conklin was a functional tight end for the Jets. Unless Bowers is great, you need Bowers to be a big upgrade over Conklin, I think. And I don't know, he very well could be. He's got a lot of speed. He's got a lot of great physical tools, but I don't know that you can guarantee that he's going to be, because the recent history of drafting tight ends has been disappointing. I feel like every couple of years there's some tight end who's incredibly athletic, who's they say is going to come in and revolutionize the league, and it almost never happens. I mean, the latest one was Kyle Pitts 3 years ago, and Kyle Pitts got off to a great start. He had over 1,000 yards his rookie season, but the last 2 years have not been good. I mean, you want to go back before that, we could talk about O.J. Howard, a guy who, put together some solid seasons, but was nowhere near the quality of player he needed to be to justify his draft status as a first-round pick. A couple of years before that, Eric Ebron, guy drafted in the first round. Again, another incredible mismatch. It didn't really work out that well. I mean, again, he had a couple decent seasons, but it didn't, he did not revolutionize the position. You want to go back to 2006, Vernon Davis, guy who was a really solid tight end, guy who was an upper echelon tight end in the league, but I don't think you could say justified a top 10 selection. And that's kind of the point. Vernon Davis was always a well above average tight end, but I don't think you could look back on that draft and say the 49ers made the right choice picking him in the top 10. There's not really a lot of margin for error. Another thing I'd say is, I think with the Jets, and I don't know how realistic the Jets are about their coaching situation. The Jets coaches, I question whether they have the ability to scheme properly for a great tight end. I just don't know whether Nathaniel. I mean, I think if your passing game is going to be run through the tight end, or if the tight end is going to be a featured guy in your passing game, your coaching staff has to do some things that are kind of unconventional, because most of the time the passing game runs through wide receivers. And I don't know that Nathaniel Hackett's going to be a guy who can adjust to that. And I think now, I don't know whether the Jets believe that. I mean, Hackett's still around, so maybe the Jets still believe he can do that, but I'm skeptical of that. And I mean, the other thing is, you may say, well, the Jets need to build around Aaron Rodgers. So they need somebody who's going to make an impact immediately. Well, rookie tight ends usually don't make an immediate impact. Pitts was the only tight end since the year 2000 to go over 1,000 yards as a rookie. In fact, I mean, if you want to talk about impact, there are only 16 tight ends since 2000 who have had even 500 yards. Our friend Chris Herndon was one of them. He had 502 yards back in 2018. I mean, that was a very promising rookie season. You may remember how it felt like Chris Herndon was going to be a really good tight end in this league after a 500-yard rookie season, because that doesn't happen all that often. And then, things kind of fell apart for him. But, if you're looking for immediate impact, and I think that's kind of, to me, like picking Bowers is like the pick you're making for immediate impact, because he's like the one guy who would immediately step into the starting lineup and have a big role. If you draft a tackle, he's probably going to spend at least the first part of his career is either on the right side or as the primary backup. If you draft a wide receiver, he's going to be your number 3 wide receiver. You draft a tight end, he becomes a full-time player right off the bat. And I think like that's the argument, is that and I don't think it's a very good argument, because I think the draft should be really focused on the long run. But I think if you draft a tight end, the argument is that he's going to be a guy who plays right off the bat. Well, even if he does, I mean, how much are you expecting? I mentioned only one tight end with 1,000 yards, only 16 tight ends with 500 yards. If we want to talk 600, only 6 with 600 yards, only 4 with 700 yards, only 3 with 800 yards as rookies since the year 2000. So you can't get an immediate. It's very difficult. I shouldn't say you can't, but very difficult to get an immediate impact out of the tight end position. So it just seems to me like this pick would be mismatched. I feel like this pick would get a lot of praise, and it could be very good. And I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying Brock Bowers is necessarily going to be a bad player, but I don't like the risk-reward ratio. An area where I like the risk-reward ratio much better is at the wide receiver position. And while the majority of mock drafts are sending Bowers to the Jets, there are a couple of outliers that have the Jets addressing wide receiver. We'll talk about them as we continue on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. I've used Gametime myself. I haven't gone to a baseball game yet using Gametime, but I have gone to U.S. Open tennis. I've gone to a Broadway show. I've gone to a college football bowl game. great app to use. You can save up to 60% buying last-minute tickets for sports, comedy, music, theater, anything you want you can go to, and you can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. And again, Gametime, an official authorized ticket seller of Major League Baseball. So if you want to see the Yankees, they could become a hot ticket because they're off to a great start. Gametime might be the place to go if you're going to go see the Mets. I mean, they're not doing so well. You may not want to pay a lot of money, so make sure you get the best deals, and you do that by using the Gametime app. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as big news breaks. Today, we're looking at some recent mock drafts, getting an idea of which players could interest the Jets, which players could be available around the time the Jets picked 10th overall, and getting the idea of which scenarios could play themselves out come draft day. Now, as we mentioned in the first segment, over half of current mock drafts have the Jets selecting University of Georgia tight end Brock Bowers with the 10th overall pick. Pick I would not be a huge fan of. I'll tell you a pick I'd be a bigger fan of. Rome Odunze, wide receiver out of Washington. Big part of Washington's run to the national championship game this past season. And while most of the mock drafts have Bowers going to the Jets, there are a couple that have Odunze falling to the Jets at 10 overall, and the Jets picking him. Tony Pauline has one of them. Another was by Ian Valentino of the 33rd team. So let's go through Ian Valentino's mock draft and see how Odunze could fall to the Jets. Valentino has Caleb Williams, number 1 overall to the Bears, Jalen Daniels, number 2 overall to Washington, J.J. McCarthy, 3rd overall to Minnesota. So quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3, a different order than we've been seeing in the months leading up to it. But by all accounts, J.J. McCarthy, the Michigan quarterback stock, is rising. Marvin Harrison Jr., 4th to Arizona. Joe Alt, 5th to Notre Dame. Drake May falls all the way to 6th to the Giants, quarterback out of Notre Dame. For much of the offseason, he's been viewed as the consensus number 2 overall pick, but his stock seems to be falling. Olu Fashanu falls to the Titans at 7, the tackle out of Penn State. Dallas Turner, the edge rusher out of Alabama, goes 8 to Atlanta. And Malik Neighbors goes 9th overall to the Chicago Bears. So when the Jets are on the board, there are 2 players that have been linked to them who are available. And I'm not talking about Bowers. Bowers is a guy who's been linked to the Jets, but if you've been following this, there are 2 players, and I've been talking about this through the course of the offseason, how it's like there's a big 3 tackles and a big 3 receivers. And this particular mock has 2 of the tackles going top 10 and 2 of the receivers going top 10. So that means Rome Odunze is available, who is one of the big 3 receivers, and Talisa Fuaga, the tackle out of Oregon State, another of the big 3 tackles. And this is an example of why, if you're a Jets fan, it's a good thing if 4 quarterbacks go in the top 10. I think the perceptions that there are going to be at least 3 quarterbacks going in the top 10, but you want a 4th because, right or wrong, and I think I would argue wrong, the Jets are probably not even going to consider a quarterback in the top 10 this year. So when a player is drafted who you have no interest in, that's what you want to see. You want to see guys you aren't interested in go before 10, because that pushes guys the Jets are interested in down to them. And they have a choice between a tackle and a wide receiver. And in this particular mock, they go wide receiver. And I tend to agree with that. And it's not so much a philosophical thing about wanting a wide receiver over a tackle. In fact, I might lean towards tackle more than wanting a wide receiver. But I just think Odunze is probably a better prospect than Fuaga is. And if you've added Odunze, you're kind of putting him into a perfect situation at the wide receiver position, because you're not going to ask that much of him in year 1. Now, he's going to be a starter because right now, amazingly, after all the offseason moves they've made, after all the spots where they've at least made upgrades on paper, somehow the Jets currently have Xavier Gibson slated to be their starting slot receiver, which is obviously less than an ideal situation. So Odunze would take over as a starting receiver. And you may wonder, well, is he going to play the slot, or are they going to move Garrett Wilson to the slot? I would not get too obsessed with those designations. In today's NFL, you don't have a receiver who's attached to a certain spot on the field. In the past, you've had what's known as an X receiver, who's a guy who lines up on the outside, right on the line of scrimmage, and you had a Z receiver, a guy who lines up on the other side, but he's a little bit behind the line of scrimmage, and then you have the guy who lines up in the slot. Those designations are kind of going out the window in today's NFL. Wide receivers are lining up all over the place. Sometimes you line up at the X, sometimes you line up at the Z, sometimes you line up in the slot. There's more versatility in where guys line up. So, if you're wondering, will they, what will that mean for Garrett Wilson? Will he play in the slot? Well, don't worry about that so much, because every receiver the Jets have is going to line up in multiple places. Now, I do think the proportion with which Garrett Wilson could line up in the slot could go up, because then you have two bigger receivers in Mike Williams and Odunze starting for you. But I'd like the idea of drafting a receiver this year, because I'm not a big believer in the idea that you want a rookie to be forced to make an immediate impact. I don't like the situations where it's like, if this guy doesn't make an impact right off the bat, we're in big trouble. And in the case of Odunze, you can kind of ease him into the lineup, because you have Garrett Wilson, who's your number one receiver, and you have Mike Williams, who's your number two receiver. And to me, it's like the perfect situation, because Odunze is still going to get plenty of chances. And if he goes and plays really well, if he goes out there and lights it up immediately, it's not like it's impossible for him to supplant Mike Williams as the number two receiver, but you don't necessarily need it. Mike Williams is a reliable second receiver. And the other thing is that the Odunze gives you some injury insurance. If Mike Williams goes down, and I tend to think people overstate the injury risk with Mike Williams. I've been saying that a lot, and I think it's true. If you look through his career, last year he had the ACL, and he has had some bumps and bruises along the way, but it's not typically a guy who misses a lot of games. But in the event he gets injured, if that something happens with Garrett, Odunze then can step up into that number two role. And, it's not going to be as dire as it was last year when you started the season with Lazard as your number two receiver. You're in a much better spot. The receiver depth is much better. I mean, I think, Aaron Rodgers probably would be happy. So I think that there's a lot to be gained by adding a receiver like Rome Odunze. And I also think he's a really good prospect. He's a guy who, probably, I don't want to use the phrase possession receiver, because that implies he's not capable of making big plays, but Odunze is not a guy who's really a burner, but he has like almost every other trait that you could want in a receiver. I think he's got a really high ceiling. I think he's a guy who could be really good in this league. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a position that was very popular for mock drafts early in the offseason, but not so much now. That's tackle. And we'll talk about one player who the Jets could be interested in, one player they could pick at 10, as we continue this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run? Would you take a nap? Would you read a book? Would you show up for a friend? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. Therapy has many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're going through some recent mock drafts to get a sense of which players could be available for the Jets with the 10th overall pick. At the beginning of the offseason, a lot of mocks, I'd say most mocks, had the Jets picking a tackle at 10, and the additions of Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses have made that less of an urgent need. Although I'd argue it's still a need, because they're both 33 and they're both in the final year of their contract. Still, not a lot of mocks seem to have the Jets going tackle at 10 anymore. There is one, however. It's from Brian Diardo of CBS Sports, which was just posted yesterday. So again, let's go through the players who were picked before the Jets go. And Caleb Williams, number 1 overall to Chicago. Drake May, number 2 overall to Washington. Jalen Daniels, 3rd overall to New England. So again, 1, 2, 3 quarterback to begin the draft. Number 4 is Marvin Harrison Jr. to Arizona. 5 has Malik Neighbors, a wide receiver, to the Chargers. 6 has J.J. McCarthy, a quarterback, to the Giants. 7 is Joe Alt, a wide receiver, going to Tennessee. 8 is Dallas Turner, edge rusher, going to Atlanta. And 9 is J.C. Latham, a tackle, going to the Chicago Bears. And 10th is Talise Fuaga, who tackle we've talked a lot about out of Oregon State, going to the Jets. So the Jets take Fuaga, and it's interesting because there are a couple of players that could have interested the Jets in this spot. One of whom I think is Olu Fashanu out of Penn State. So in this case, the Jets would go tackle at 10, and they'd have the opportunity to choose between Fuaga and Fashanu. And the Jets in this mock take Fuaga. I think that's an interesting call. I might go with Fashanu in this situation. And the reason for that is I think Fashanu could play left tackle in this league. And it's kind of a weird take for me from the standpoint that I think in many ways Fuaga may have a higher ceiling, because I just think if you look at Fuaga's power combined with his athleticism, if it clicks for him, he's going to be really, really good. And the other thing is, you could almost make the case Fuaga is safer, because if he struggles at tackle, you can move him inside the guard, and he's probably going to be a really good guard. So in some ways, I feel like Fuaga has a higher ceiling and a higher floor. I still might prefer Fashanu, though, just because he can play left tackle, and his movement skills are just top notch. And left tackle is just one of those spots you have to find a solution. I'm not sure if Fuaga could play there. That said, I mean, I would have a tough time complaining about Fuaga for the reasons I laid out. It may not be an immediate pressing need, but it's a need. It's not even like a long-term need. It's a need for next year. And that's like where people lose me when they say pick Brock Bowers, because, well, Bowers is the one guy who could step into the starting lineup and take a role right off the bat. Well, it's not like we're talking 5 years down the line if the Jets draft a tackle. In fact, if they draft somebody like Fuaga, I would fully expect him to get an opportunity to compete for a starting job. I mean, this is a guy the Jets are drafting top 10. If you're drafting somebody in the top 10, odds are you think that they can play right off the bat. And I think that Morgan Moses could easily slide to the bench. He could easily slide to a kind of like a super sub role where I don't think Morgan Moses would ever play left tackle, but if something happened to Tyron Smith, he'd go to right tackle, or you could slide guys, or you could start to slide guys around the line. It just would make sense to me. And I don't even think it's a longer term type thing, because I think Fuaga could easily take a starting role in year one. And even if he doesn't, again, the Jets are probably going to have some injuries on the offensive line. So, the guy you drafted 10 is going to be your first guy off the bench. He'll step right in if there's an injury. And, your number 6 offensive lineman can be a critical player on your team. Now, I think the Jets, if they suffer an injury and they take Fuaga, they're going to have to reshuffle some guys, especially if Tyron Smith goes down. I mean, they're going to have a couple of options. And we'll see what happens, but I do think Fuaga would be in the mix. I think they'd probably reshuffle their line in some way, and Fuaga would probably step into the lineup in some respect. So I don't even think you could say it's really a long-term move. But a year from now, the Jets are going to need a tackle. And I mentioned this on Friday. We keep talking about the Jets needing to focus on the here and now. We keep talking about the Jets being a win now team. We talk about the Jets being all in. Well, the Jets have done enough to be all in. I mean, it's okay to think a little bit about your future. And I think that Fuaga would be a good choice from that standpoint. I think it's the kind of guy who could both help you now and help you down the line. Now, again, I slightly prefer Fashanu, and it's a weird take, because I think you could make a case Fuaga both has a higher ceiling and a higher floor, but that left tackle position is just a tough one. And I think about DeBrickashaw Ferguson. Was DeBrickashaw Ferguson ever an All-Pro? No. He made a couple Pro Bowls. Was DeBrickashaw Ferguson ever a top 5 left tackle in this league? Maybe a couple years, maybe there was like a 2-3 stretch, I'd say through like 08 through 2010. Maybe he was a top 5 tackle. But aside from that, he was just a really steady guy. And he played a really important position. You stuck him at left tackle, you didn't have to worry about it for a decade. And yeah, I think sometimes we get obsessed with the idea, you pick a guy, in the top 10, he absolutely has to be a superstar. Now, again, this goes back to what I was talking about with Bowers. If you draft a tight end, he almost has to be a superstar. But if you have a margin for error, and I think left tackle is one of those positions where you have a margin for error, where even if you don't get a guy who's an absolute superstar, if you get a guy who can hold that position down and give you reliable football for 8 to 10 years, it's a great pick in the top 10, because a bad left tackle can destroy a team. And when you have a solid left tackle, it's just something you don't have to worry about. And by the way, left tackles are really hard to find in this league. They usually don't hit the market in free agency, and if they do, there's somebody like Tyron Smith, who, while he's very good, is an injury risk. If you draft Fashanu, the concerns about Tyron Smith, I think, go way down, and you have an opportunity to move forward with your team and your offensive line. Suddenly, long-term outlook of your offensive line looks pretty decent if AVT stays healthy, because you've got Fashanu at left tackle, you've got Tippmann at center, and you've got AVT, who, knock on wood, you hope will be able to have put together a healthy year this season. And suddenly, even the longer-term trajectory of your team is not looking as bad, at least on the offensive line. But, I can't complain about the Jets going offensive line, even if it's Fuaga, because I think that would be a really good pick. I think that it would be a sound decision. And I think that, it's an area where people are kind of ignoring it. And I think they're ignoring it at their own peril, because I think if the Jets ignored it, I think it would be at their own peril, because it's a critical spot and the Jets need to figure out some long-term answers there. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast first, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and like it, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.